All right. Kendra, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Um, I think remembering Labor Day is coming up and thinking about the way in which we value labor in our society is going to be important. And then I also want just to take a moment to honor Miss Fay. I think everybody has a Miss Fay story. And the one I have, I think Minna will remember. This was at More Than a Meal once. I don't know what happened, but for some reason we couldn't find the chalice and Peyton that we ordinarily use with More Than a Meal worship service. And so someone asked, could we just use the regular church stuff? And I'm not sure why, but there was sort of a moment of hesitation. And Miss Fay grabbed the normal church stuff, handed it to Fred Terry, who was our liturgist at the time, and said, one church, one cup. And that was the end of that. It was theologically astute. It was, she did, if a theologian had said it, it would have taken me 2 paragraphs. And she, in 4 words, named, I think, really the spirit that she brought to her ministry in that kitchen. One church, one cup. And anybody who came needing food got the food they needed. And so just, I think, taking a moment to remember Ms. Fay and be grateful for her presence among us. Let us pray. Blessed are you, O God, giver of all good gifts, for the gift of Miss Fay's presence in our midst, for her fried chicken, for her compassion for all, for the bellies that have been filled, from the youngest among us seeking an extra dessert, to the oldest struggling to get to the buffet line, from the most affluent offering extra donations to ensure costs are covered, to the poorest showing up at the back door hoping for a handout, for the labor of Miss Fay's hands, for the love within her heart, for the astute mind that knew where theology rests and where it goes into action. For her whole life, we give you thanks. O God of all good gifts, we take this time to remember those who labor with their hands, those who stand long hours, those whose voices are not heard when choices are made, when policies are set. O God, teach us to look for the laborers in our midst, the ones whose work puts our lives at ease, whose labor we are likely to overlook and undervalue. God, make us your agents and advocates as we stand with those who labor and organize a society in which they are valued, in which their lives have time for Sabbath, in which their pantries are filled with good things to eat, in which their children are provided with a good education. O God of all who labor, we remember before you Miss Fay. We remember before you all who work, and we pray your blessings upon them. Be with us now as we seek your guidance and your truth in the sacred stories of your people. All this we pray in the name of Christ. Amen. Okay, so today we are returning to our theme of the Bible and the city. And what we're thinking about is the way urbanization in the ancient world affected the theology that gets communicated to us in biblical texts. So a couple of things to notice. So far, it's all been pretty negative, right? Cities have not been places where we get happy stories. And yet we know that the people who were writing and telling these stories were living in urban contexts. And so I think part of what we have to struggle with is, what were they trying to come to terms with? And so this, I think, is a good moment to pause and remind ourselves what we're doing when we are reading biblical texts, especially when we are reading texts that offer themselves as histories. So today, I hope you have Bibles with you. Get your Bibles out and find 1 Kings chapter 11. We're gonna spend a little time in 1 Kings chapter 11. And I'm gonna start in verse 41 and then go backward from there. I want to start in verse 31 because it points out something important that we're likely to overlook. Okay, did I give you long enough? I'm gonna just call on someone randomly, and this is sort of like whoever happens to be below me on the Brady Bunch screen. So Cherry Falls, you are right below me. Do you have a Bible there? And if so, can you unmute yourself and could you read verse 41?
Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, as well as his wisdom, are they not written in the book of Acts of Solomon? The time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem and over all Israel was 40 years. Solomon slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of his father David, and his son Rehoboam succeeded him.
Thank you. Okay, now take a look. Some of you may not have been able to hear Cherry, but take a look at those verses, and especially at verse 41. Notice something about verse 41. What's going on there? What is 1 Kings telling us in that verse? And when you're ready, just unmute yourself and pop in with your comment.
Seems like there's some other book of history besides the one that you're reading right now.
Yeah, Solomon did a bunch of stuff, and we don't care about all the stuff Solomon did. We care about some of the stuff. We've written some of the stuff here. The rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did, as well as his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? Right? Can you think who might have written such a thing as the book of the Acts of Solomon? Who might that have been? You have to think a little bit about the ancient world and what it's like to be a king.
Maybe it
Tim,
was children.
Why do you say children?
I don't know, because a father would like to be remembered by his children. And if he's a famous father, then they might write a biography of him.
Absolutely, that's a possibility. Maybe Solomon's children wrote a biography of their great father, right? And so it's saying we don't have to repeat everything Solomon did because it's written down somewhere else, and maybe that's a biography that his children wrote. In this case, it's not a biography his children wrote, but that was a really good guess. I like the way you think, right? If you think about an ancient king, you would have a whole court, right? And in your court, you would have somebody who represents the priests, and you would have somebody who represents artisans guilds, and you would have a chief general, a military leader, and you would have somebody who's responsible for collecting your taxes. You got a whole court of bureaucrats who are responsible for administering the kingdom. And one of the most important offices would be the chronicler. So you would always have a court chronicler who's responsible for keeping track of all the stuff the king does and write it down. And so for every king, we would have something like a book of the Acts of King so-and-so. So what the author here is telling you is that everything Solomon did is written down somewhere. And we don't have to repeat everything because it's all written somewhere else. Now, we no longer have the book of the Acts of Solomon, right? It's not extant. If it is, it's buried somewhere in an ancient library, and an archaeologist someday will hit the jackpot and find it. But as it stands, we don't have that book. So we don't know what's in it. But the fact that it exists and the fact that the author of First Kings doesn't tell you all the stuff in there tells you something about First Kings. What does it tell you that the author of First Kings says, I'm not telling you everything Solomon did, just some of it? What can you glean from that? If you were the author of First Kings and you decided not to repeat everything this king did, what would you choose?
The things that made him look good.
Okay, you might choose just the things that make Solomon look good. All right. What else might be your principle of selection?
You might choose things that were later important in what happened after that.
You might choose things that were important later. If the chronicler is writing everything down as you go, the author of First Kings is looking back and saying, well, how many pounds of barley they bought in that year doesn't seem relevant right now. We're not going to take everything. But the fact that Solomon built the temple to Yahweh, that's important. We'll remember that. And the fact that Solomon married oodles of women who brought foreign gods to Jerusalem, that's important. We'll want to remember that. So they didn't actually just take the stuff that made him look good, right? They took the stuff that became important later. But also, that kind of selectiveness is because they're building a theology. And they're going to choose stories that are exemplars of that theology. So this is a really important thing to remember about ancient historians. It's also true of modern historians. The job of the historian is not to tell you everything. This happened, and then that happened, and then that happened, and then that happened. The job of the historian is to organize things that happened in a story that helps us understand what was going on, right? But also that help us understand what's going on right now. And right now doesn't mean the time we live in. Right now means the time the historian lived in. So you always need, when you're reading these ancient materials, to ask, who produced this and what was their agenda, right? What were they trying to persuade people of? It's not an objective history. It doesn't make any effort to be objective. It's trying to make a point, and you want to know, what's the point? What's the historian trying to persuade us of? And that'll partly help us make sense of why the historian chose certain stories and not others to tell. You also want to remember that ancient historians weren't making this sharp division between fiction and nonfiction that modern historians make. They would sometimes create a speech and put it in the mouth of a great leader as a way of saying, this is the kind of thing this king might have wanted to communicate. So, friends, Romans, lend me your ears. I can't even remember who said that. Was it Julius Caesar? Does anybody remember?
I think it's Mark Antony.
Yeah.
It's in
Yeah.
Julius Caesar, though.
Yeah, Mark Antony, that would make sense. Okay, he never said that, right? I mean, the chances that he actually said those words are pretty much nil. And if you read, Thucydides, it's the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, it's filled with great speeches by generals and different leaders, and probably none of them ever said any of those things. What Thucydides is trying to do is tell us, this kind of offers a synopsis of what was going on, right? So that we get a sense, without having to go through all the nitty gritty of every little thing everybody said, we get a sense of, okay, here's how these were the reasons that they decided to go to war. These are the reasons they decided to stay at war. These are the reasons they decided to change course, right? That's how ancient history works. And it's not just the Bible, it's ancient historians generally understood their job to be communicating the heart of the matter, the truth that mattered, to later people, not to capture kind of with precise accuracy what was going on at the time. So know that about this historian. And we call the historian in First Kings the Deuteronomistic historian, which is a mouthful. The Deuteronomistic historian. Whew. so we're just going to say the DH, right? And the DH cared about one thing above anything else. The DH cared about covenant faithfulness to Yahweh. The Deuteronomistic historian lived in the exilic or post-exilic period and was trying to figure out why Israel ended up in exile. So they tell this story where God promises an everlasting kingdom to David. And then if it's an everlasting kingdom, why did you end up in exile? And the answer is sort of like, because it was conditional. Because God said, if you will be my people, then I will be your God. But if you start worshiping these other gods, then, you know, you're going to have to suffer the consequences. So we've just ended the reign of Solomon, who worshiped hundreds of other gods. And that's setting us up for everything that happens after that. So that tells us who this DH is and what their priorities are. Last thing, you also, in these ancient histories, you want to look to see if there are any remnants of an original document. So like historians didn't just write things from scratch. They went out and gathered up. They might gather up what the chronicler had recorded. They might gather up oral tradition. They might gather up folk tales, other things that are going on. And then they sort of borrow those sources and put them in an order that makes sense for their story. They don't use footnotes for the most part because nobody had an idea of what plagiarism was in the ancient world. So they just put everything together. And so sometimes what you're doing is looking for, there'll be this little telltale sign, like this doesn't quite fit, right? This doesn't quite fit the narrative. And sometimes what you're seeing there is like, peeling back the layers of an onion, and you're finding, oh, this is a remnant of an older source that got incorporated, even though it doesn't quite fit perfectly. Okay, so now let's work backward in chapter 11 and get to this stuff about urbanism. So I'm gonna do a quick screen share to give you a sense of the stuff I want you kind of keeping your eyes on. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so we're going to be working through 1 Kings 11, 26 through 40, and then chapter 12. And pay attention to these characters, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and then pay attention to these sites, Bethel, Shechem, Penuel, and Jerusalem. Now you should recognize all four of those as places we visited last Sunday. I'm sure you memorized the geography we covered last Sunday, right? But these are places we've seen before and we'll just remember them. All right, so here we are in 1 Kings chapter 11, and I need somebody to read verses 27 and 28, just those two, verse 27 and 28. I'm going to read 26, and then let me see. Mary Edith, you are right below me. Can you get ready to read 26 and 27?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to let you off the hook for 26 because it's a lot of names, and I hate making people pronounce names. If, by the way, you're reading and you come across something you don't know how to pronounce, just go whatever, like we get it. Okay, this is verse 26. Jeroboam, son of Nabat, an Ephraimite of Zeradah, a servant of Solomon, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, rebelled against the king. Mary Edith.
The following was the reason he rebelled against the king. Solomon built the Millo and closed up the gap in the wall of the city of his father David. The man Jeroboam was very able, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph.
Okay, let's just pause for a minute and let me hear from you about what you noticed in those two verses. Anything jumped out at you?
Forced labor.
Forced labor. Remember when I told you he has there's a court and there's somebody in charge of everything, right? This is a minister of forced labor. This is a normal office in the court of an ancient king. So what? Why would you have a minister of forced labor?
You need a slave master.
Okay, you need a slave master. Now this is tricky. These may not, strictly speaking, be slaves. This is conscripted labor. Try to imagine how we might have a draft board for military service, right? They would have had something like that, a draft board for different kinds of labor that they need. So they need to patch up a hole in the city wall. We're going to come back to that in a minute. They need to patch up a hole in the city wall. And so you may need to conscript brick masons. You may need to conscript, kind of unskilled labor just to haul things around. You may need to conscript people to bring food and water to the laborers. So yeah, there's forced labor. So this is a kind of a conscripted labor force. The king needs lots of stuff, and not all of that is paid for with taxes, like the way we think of paying taxes. Sometimes you're taxed in the sense that part of your labor goes to the king. Okay, is there anything else that jumps out at you from those couple of verses?
He built this thing that has a name, and I don't know what that thing is.
Yeah, he built Millo and closed up the gap in the wall. I don't know what, wait a minute, 9:15. Sorry, I'm looking at the footnotes and going back. I should have looked that up before we started. What did he build? This is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon conscripted to build the house of the Lord and his own house, the Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem. Millo, probably terraces supporting the walls and public buildings of Jerusalem. Okay, I should have looked that up before class. Okay, he built, this is some kind of structure that supports the wall, and it looks like they have sort of terraces on top of it. Okay, so he, sorry, I lost my place here. Jeroboam was the minister of forced labor, and he was in charge when they closed up a gap in the wall, when they built the Millo, okay, the terraces. Okay, anything else you notice?
I noticed that Jeroboam was very industrious. He was good at what he did.
He was industrious. He was good at what he did.
And so Solomon rewarded his merit.
Yeah, we have a pretty positive portrayal of Jeroboam here, which is going to be surprising in a few minutes when you find out what Jeroboam does. But yeah, he's pretty positive portrayal. He's industrious. He does a good job. He knows how to manage the conscripted labor. But also notice the city has a wall. You don't patch a hole in the wall if there's not a wall there. Why would the city have a wall?
Protection.
Yeah, protection from whom?
Other countries.
Okay, other nations, when you build a wall, it's because you have something people want and might take, and you need to defend against that. So, gosh, it's hard to talk about a wall right now without thinking about the politics of it, right? But, I mean, in the ancient world, if you think about when you're a nomad and you live in tents, you don't have walls. And that's partly because you don't store anything that somebody might take, right? If you slaughter an animal for food, you've got to eat it within a certain amount of time. You're not hauling a lot of goods around with you. And what's more, if you're not a settled agriculturalist, you don't have things like grains that can be stored in silos that get you through a famine. But if you are living in an agricultural settlement, you've got something like silos where you store grain that might get you through a famine. And when the famine comes, if there's a city-state or a nation or any kind of enemy that maybe didn't plan as well, or maybe their silo burned down, or who knows what, they're going to raid you for the stuff you want, for the stuff they want. And so as you get increasing settled agriculture and you get increasing urbanization as a result of that, because people need to live together to cooperate over the harvest. They need a place to store it, and they need walls to defend it. So what you should be seeing here is a trajectory that sort of it's almost like dominoes falling. Once one falls, others start to follow. Once one group leaves the nomadic lifestyle and begins settled agriculture, it becomes hard for other groups to remain nomadic. They're going to start being dependent on those urban centers for all kinds of trade goods. Once you're living in an urban context, you're going to have to start doing things like building walls, organizing common defense, and you're going to have to start some kind of system of taxation to run all of that. Otherwise, you get the free rider problem, right? If we all just say, okay, well, we will cooperate to defend the city, I get the benefit of that cooperation even if I don't participate in it, right? Well, that's not fair. You don't want the free rider Hotz getting her stuff defended even though she won't cooperate with that. So what do? You tax and you conscript. Once you've done that, then you have to start building up the administrative apparatus that lets the thing run. And so what you're seeing is this kind of snowball effect. I started with dominoes, now I'm snowballs, right? Where urbanization becomes a force that continues under its own weight, or the sort of, my metaphors are all over the place, but you get what I mean, right? I hope somebody nod and tell me I'm not just blathering here, okay? This is what I hate about teaching remotely. I can't see all of you and what you're doing, and you don't seem as willing to just interrupt and say, hey, I want to talk, but you should. Okay, so what you're seeing here is just the very fact that you've got a city, you've got a wall, tells you that you've got this kind of increasing force of urbanization, and you've got this administrative infrastructure. We didn't hear anything about a minister of forced labor when we were in Genesis, right? When we were mostly thinking about nomads, and when the cities were still kind of smallish towns, we saw some walls, Sodom had a wall, but we didn't see this kind of, this looks more like a modern city might, with modern infrastructure and administrative, kind of the bureaucracy of the thing. Okay, so let's keep going. Can I get a volunteer who can read for us verses 29 through 33? I was going to call on somebody, but I'm having trouble.
I'll try 29 through 33.
Yeah.
Okay. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did."
Okay, so what just happened? There's real subtle symbolism here.
The prophet just ran into him on the road and said, hey, you're going to rebel against Solomon and get 10 of the 12 tribes, and Solomon's going to get another one, and the number of tribes is always sort of iffy. But anyway, hey, you're going to be king of all these people. Surprise.
Yeah, so Jeroboam, who's the minister of forced labor and pretty good at his job, is now being told, I have to punish Solomon for worshiping other gods. And so I'm going to make you king over 10 of the 12 tribes. And Solomon only gets to keep 1. Wait, who got left out? right? There's supposed to be 12 tribes, and I'm not great with math, but 10 plus 1 does not equal 12. It's an interesting thing to track throughout here. It keeps referring to the one tribe, and then every once in a while it goes, oh, right, and Benjamin, right? So Benjamin is that 12th tribe. And if you remember, the kingdom in the south gets named Judah, and Judah is the name of one of the 12 tribes. So 12 tribes, 11, 10, whatever, right? 12 is an important number symbolically. So there have to be 12, and we'll kind of toss Benjamin in order to give 2 tribes in the south. Okay, so, and then he makes this conditional covenant with Jeroboam. If you will do what's right, then I will make an everlasting covenant with you the way I did with David. And that doesn't last very long. Okay, so Solomon gets word of this. He chases Jeroboam off. Jeroboam flees to Jerusalem, and then Solomon dies. Now we're going to pick up in chapter 12, where Solomon has died and Jeroboam is coming back to Israel. All right, chapter 12, verse 1. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. You remember Shechem? Do you remember that place? We talked about it last time. You may not remember what happened there, but this was the place where one of 2 things happened, depending on which author you're reading. In the non-Yahwistic account, maybe the E account, or maybe a separate source, there was a kind of a city-state there, and Abimelech came out and made an offer to Jacob to settle peacefully, that there would be intermarriage, that they would have economic relationships, and Jacob seems like he's going to go along with that. In the Yahwistic text, what happens is that Abimelech has raped Dinah, Jacob's daughter, and he's making that offer as a kind of peace treaty. Jacob seems inclined to go along with it, but his sons are not, and they end up slaughtering all of the residents of Shechem. Either way, at the end of that, an altar is built there. And so this is a place that we have associated with one of the patriarchs. And it looks like in this period, you still go back to this place for the making of kings. This is also one of the first places in the Bible that king making shows up. In the book of Judges, there's a judge called Midian, and the people offered to make him king, and he said, no, only God is king. This happened at Shechem. It's not really clear that he agreed not to be king, though, because he named his son Abimelech, which means my father is king. So, okay, I don't know if he made him king or not. Maybe he was referring to God as his father, but probably Midian did become king. So this is a place that's kind of associated with king making. And Rehoboam goes there to be made king, but there's still not a city there. At this point, it's just kind of a sacred site because it's associated with Jacob. Okay, so continuing here. Then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. Now we're in verse 3. And they sent him and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he's placed upon us, and we will serve you. He, this is Rehoboam, said to them, go away for 3 days and then come again to me. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the older men. So take a look there at verse 6 and 7, and tell me, what did the older men advise Rehoboam to do?
They say, look, when you have a new king, what you do is you cancel some taxes, you tell them that you're not going to make them work as hard, and then they're going to follow you. Like, you should serve them, but at least tell them that you're going to serve them.
Yeah. So he's saying, oh, he made my screen share stop. Okay, that's easier. Yeah, so what the older men are advising is, you're a new king. You have not earned the trust of these people yet. you need to show them that you are their servant. And so to do that, ease up a little bit on what you're requiring of them. It is important to remember that Solomon had been on a building spree. Like, he had really been building up Jerusalem. He built the palace, he built the wall, he built the Milo that we now know what that is, right? He's really building out the city, and that's a lot of forced labor. And you know, they're saying, maybe you better ease up a little bit and let people get used to this new thing, and then we'll see from there, right? Okay, verse 8, but he disregarded the advice that the older men gave him and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and now attended him. Okay, I'm just going to go out on a limb as somebody who teaches young men at college and say, when you're making affairs of state, don't listen to the young men, right? Like, they don't think well about consequences yet. So this will be borne out. He said to them, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? And the young men who had grown up with him, these are especially privileged young men, right? These are not the sons of the forced laborers. These are the ones who've grown up with him. And that means these are the kind of kids who would have been raised at court and shielded from all of that conscripted labor. I am really restraining myself right now. The young man who had grown up with him said, thus you should say to this people who spoke to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us. Thus you say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now, whereas my father laid you a heavy yoke, I will add to it. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. This has got to be the most young manish insult in the entire Bible. Like, I think this has got to be a remnant of something original, because it sounds like something young men would say, right? So what did the young men advise that Rehoboam do? Say again, Sherry? Yeah, sort of double down on it. Make it even harder on them. Yeah, and there's this interesting thing about masculinity here too, right? That I'm more of a man than my father was. So this insult about my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. I'm more of a man than he was, and I can prove I'm more of a man because I can force you to do stuff, right? There's this kind of really problematic construction of masculinity there, that being a real man means being able to make people do stuff. So Rehoboam says, you know, I'm a real man. This does actually remind me of that ridiculous moment from the debates 4 years ago when some of the candidates were comparing the size of their hands. Do you remember that? Remember this? There was a Republican debate before Trump was the nominee, and they were arguing about who had the biggest hands. And you're seeing a very similar kind of thing here. This has been, this is telling us is that this has been ridiculous for like 3 millennia. Okay, so Jeroboam goes to the people and he tells them, Rehoboam goes and says, I'm going to make everything even harder for you. And now we're going to pick up in verse 15. So the king did not listen to the people, because it was the turn of affairs that brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken to Ahijah the Shilonite, to Jeroboam son of Nebat. When all the people of Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, the people answered the king, what share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, O David. So Israel went away to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah. Just look at that really carefully. What just happened there?
These people who went away, they were the 10 tribes.
They were the 10 tribes.
Right. So Judah is the one that's left for Solomon's people to have. Gotcha. Well, they got out of there. I mean, they
They
didn't
got
put up with it.
They seceded.
Okay, there's a secession here. But look where they went.
Yeah, they literally like left and went away to, I guess, yeah, there's some tents versus the towns of Judah. There's probably something there, but they didn't like say we're going to have a different country. They just went to somewhere else and decided not to listen to anybody anymore.
Yeah, they physically went away. The first they say, we don't have an inheritance from David, right? So part of what they're doing is saying, we remember back to the days before there was a united monarchy, right? We remember back to the days when there was this confederacy and we were not part of David and his inheritance. We weren't part of Judah. And so why should we remain loyal to Judah? But also, to your tents, O Israel. But notice that Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah. So you're getting this interesting split here between the Israelites who are identifying themselves as tent dwellers and the Judahites who are identifying themselves as urbanites. And then the very next thing they do, when King Rehoboam set Adoram, who was taskmaster over forced labor, he took Jeroboam's job. Now he's the minister of forced labor. All of Israel stoned him to death. So Rehoboam sent them this minister of conscription, right? And said, all right, guys, come on, you've got to help us keep building up these cities. And the people stoned him. And so this is a kind of labor uprising against the management, right? Management is saying, we got to keep building these towns. We're going to come and we're going to force your labor again. And the people, it's a kind of union organizing, reject the management and say, no, we're not going to do this forced labor anymore. And so they go away. And verse 20 tells us, there was no one who followed the house of David except the tribe of Judah alone. And then in the next verse, we find out, oh, right, Benjamin was there too. And so we end up with 2 tribes in the south. Okay, so they separated. The 10 tribes have gone back to tent dwelling. They've moved back to the north. They are no longer going to send their laborers to the towns of Judah to build them up. And so look at what Jeroboam does. He goes to the north. And verse 25, I'm in chapter 12 now, in case you've lost track of where we are. Verse 25, Jeroboam and Rehoboam have kind of agreed, we're just going to go separate ways. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and resided there. He went out from there and built Penuel. Then pause a second. What's the first thing Jeroboam does once he becomes king?
He builds some cities.
He starts building cities, right? And we're building cities on these sacred sites. So we remember Shechem is associated with Jacob. Penuel, maybe you remember that from last Sunday too. That's the site where Jacob wrestled with the angel and built an altar there. So he's building up the city of Penuel. One of the things we're doing here is finding out that people are saying, hey, that's my hometown. This is when it got built, right? And remembering that my hometown got built on this sacred site, that Jacob had built these altars and now our cities are built around them. But also notice how important it is that they're building urban centers around those altars. That's what validates the existence of the city. So now Jeroboam is worried about something. Take a look at verse 26. Can I get a volunteer to read 26 through 28? Paige looks like he's going to do it. Make sure you unmute yourself.
Okay, you said 26.
Mm-hmm.
Let me find it here. Print's very small. Then Jeroboam said to himself, now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David. If this people continues to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, the heart of this people will return again to their master king, Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah. How many verses?
Read one more if you would.
Okay, so the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.
Okay. Yep, that's it. Thank you. So he puts one of the golden calves in Bethel, and he puts one in Dan, and he builds cities there. So that whole agreement with God didn't last very long. Okay, now look at the urban theme here. Jeroboam and Rehoboam split. Remember that the reason Jeroboam got the support of the people was because he was a labor advocate, right? He had set aside his position as minister of forced labor. He sided with the laborers and said, we should demand from Rehoboam that he lighten your burden. When Rehoboam refuses to lighten their burden, Jeroboam says, that's it, we're splitting, right? And so the people have supported him as a labor advocate. They've supported him because he's not going to conscript their labor. But how do you think those cities got built? How do you build Shechem? How do you build Penuel, let alone Bethel and Dan, right? It looks like Jeroboam may have used that labor argument as a kind of populist appeal to get the people's support. But then as soon as he's king, he starts acting like a king. And one of the things kings do is go on these major architectural campaigns. And so he's building up cities. He's forcing their labor. And he's worried that they might say, well, shuck it all in, right? Why should I help this guy? I may as well just go back to working and worshiping in Jerusalem, right? And if they do that, he's saying they'll kill me. Okay, so how do you get the people's loyalty then? If you are doing exactly the thing that they had complained about and overthrew the old king over, now you're doing that. How exactly do you go about getting their loyalty so that they won't revert to Jerusalem?
You need to give them a share of the wealth.
You could do that, or you could get preachers to tell them that you're great and that they should do what you want.
Yeah. You got two options. You're Jeroboam. You could say, you know what? This isn't fair. I'm going to set aside my privilege. I'm going to set aside my wealth, and I'm going to be an advocate for the equal distribution of the goods of the kingdom. If we need cities, that's okay. But then the people who labor to build them are going to share in their riches. Or I could get some preachers to convince the people that I'm God's chosen one. What should I do? Right? And I see Jim's grin. You know exactly what he's going to do, right? He's going to say, okay, let's throw a religious carnival and convince people that I am God's chosen one. And so that's what he does. He builds these golden calves. He sets up a temple in Bethel. He sets up one in Dan. And then he says, come here and worship here. Don't go to Jerusalem to worship. These are the gods who brought your ancestors out of Egypt. And remember, you were forced labor in Egypt, right? So there's this really kind of strange tension here between kind of advocacy for urban labor forces and religious identity. Now this, I am just going to launch right into the context we live in, because I think we see a lot of this going on now. We see people who are working in manual labor throwing their support to a leader who is not advocating for their interests, but who offers them this sort of quasi-religious vision that I'm a winner, and what you want is to be identified with the winner, right? And that's more important than your own economic self-interest is. I think, now here I want to step on some toes because I know I'm a Yankee, but I think we see some similar things with kind of Southern heritage and this identification with the Confederacy, with flying the Confederate battle flag, with insisting on monuments to Confederate soldiers. There's a way in which we are organizing a group of people to say, rather than advocate for the good of all, which would require me to sort of identify and be in solidarity with other people who are oppressed, I'm going to identify with this, I'm going to sort of identify with whiteness more than I identify with solidarity with other people who are struggling economically. That's exactly what's going on here in 1 Kings. Jeroboam is fleecing the people. He is living high on the hog, on their forced labor. He is not using his position to provide them with security, not economic security, not necessarily military security. He's just fleecing the people, right? And he's got this crew of other kind of kids who were raised at court. That's Rehoboam, sorry, but Jeroboam's got a similar kind of situation, saying, here's the way, sorry, I just conflated those two narratives. You're sort of entitled to wealth. You were born to it. And so Rehoboam in the south is doing the same thing as Jeroboam in the north. They're both building out on the backs of labor, the structures that will increase economic inequality. So today we were supposed to get to the book of Amos, and let's just hop over there real quick because I want you to see where this goes. You remember Jeroboam has built this temple at Bethel. That is 9th century. About a century later, 8th century, we show up in Bethel again with the prophet Amos. And one thing you know about Amos is that he is always calling for justice, right? And that means economic justice. I'm in chapter 3, verse 14. This is Amos chapter 3, verse 14. Amos is hard to find. It's one of those little books. Here's what Amos says. On the day I punish Israel for its transgressions, I will punish the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altars shall be cut off and fall to the ground. I will tear down the winter house as well as the summer house, and the houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall come to an end, says the Lord. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on Mount Samaria. Samaria is where Bethel is. Who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, bring me something to drink. Every time I read that verse, I pause because like every evening, Matt brings me a glass of wine and I feel like, ooh, am I one of those cows of Bashan? Bring me a drink. The Lord has sworn by his holiness, the time is surely coming upon you when they will take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. Through the breaches in the wall, notice that, through the breaches in the wall you shall leave, each one straight ahead, and you will be flung out. Okay, so what's happening here is that you've built up enormous wealth inequality through these practices of forced labor. By undervaluing the work of the commoners, nobility are increasing the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So much so that while some people are homeless, other people have two houses, right? They have a winter house and a summer house. So much so that they have lives of leisure. They don't need to work all of the time. And one of the things that means is that eventually the resentment of those underclasses is going to build up, and things like the wall don't get repaired. Or God will use a foreign army to breach that wall and punish the people for this sin. And notice that the sin is permitting economic inequality. And what will happen is that the wealthy will be pushed out through that breach in the wall. You know who won't be sent into exile? The working classes. And that was also true in that time. When the Assyrians conquered the north, the working classes stayed. It was the nobility who were scattered. A century later, or sorry, 2 centuries later, when the Babylonians conquered Judah in the south, same thing happens. It's the elite who are taken into exile and the commoners who are left behind. If you are a conquering empire, why would you leave the commoners behind? Why take the elite into exile and leave the commoners?
The elite have some skills that you can use. They took artisans and scribes and that sort of thing, but the people of the land raised crops, and that was useful too.
Yeah, it depends on the kind of skill you have. So first of all, the nobility have a sense of entitlement, right? They might demand that you return them to their positions of power. From the commoner's perspective, what difference does it make? What does it matter if Rehoboam rules you? What does it matter if Jeroboam? What does it matter if it's the Assyrians or the Babylonians? They're all the same. And your life is pretty much the same regardless of who rules over you. So you leave the commoners in place because they don't have a sense of entitlement. They're going to raise the same crops regardless of who's ruling them. You think those nobility are going to fix that breach in the wall? They don't know how to mix mortar. They don't know how to, smooth off a stone so it'll lay into the wall correctly. You need the commoners to fix the wall, to build the mansions, to grow the crops. So you leave the commoners behind because they have the skills you need right there. You take the nobility away, they do have skills, right? They can read and write and so forth, and you can use them somewhere else. But if you leave them in place, that enormous sense of entitlement is going to return. Okay, so what you've got here is a narrative arc where you're looking back to the days when everybody lived in tents and sacred sites are established with altars where something significant happened. Then you begin the process of urbanization, and that builds wealth inequality almost inevitably. Then you get to the point where there's so much wealth inequality that you begin to get class warfare. And then finally, you get a period where prophets are calling the wealthy out for their injustice. And foreign empires will end up conquering, and the elite will be taken away. One of the most interesting lines, I think, in the book of Amos happens in chapter 7. I'm going to be real quick because we're over time. Amaziah sends a message to Jeroboam II saying, you better be careful, this prophet is here and he is denouncing you. And then Amaziah the priest says to Amos the prophet, this is verse 12 of chapter 7, O seer, go, flee away, go back to Judah, earn your bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel. Why? Because it is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom. In other words, you can't preach justice here because the point of this church is to support the elite, right? The function of religion is to shore up class inequality. So you can't preach that here. Karl Marx would have had a field day with this verse, and we will come back and think a little bit more about Karl Marx next Sunday, because we want to think of those commoners who got left behind and what happened to them. All right, everybody, worship starts in about 18 minutes, so we should end now and give ourselves a break to get something to drink and find a comfortable place to sit for today's worship service at 11. Thank you, everybody.